the other day that I had to go back in and edit, cut out the first part because it does eventually start
Yes,
playing in
it
LinkedIn when
does.
it does the reverse. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot we'd
We were
have to do
just rambling about LinkedIn. I know. When I was streaming with Chris Carolyn, we would just sit there and like awkwardly stare at each other.
that.
All right, LinkedIn is up and going live. All right. Hello and welcome to Lunchable Go to Market Ops. We're your hosts, Danielle Urban.
And Sarah Lane-Hawn.
We're serving up grab and go HubSpot strategy every weekday in 15 minutes or less. And today we are going to be talking about lead scoring. We're kicking off a week full of lead scoring. And today we want to start with what are some of the common stories and practices we see around lead scoring, and maybe why they're not so great sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen a few people who haven't used it at all yet, right? But
Mhm.
that's kind of the dream scenario because then you can go in and help build it from scratch, give the proper context and use cases so that it's strategically done. But more often than not, anytime I've gone into an existing HubSpot instance, lead scoring exists. Someone's built it, someone's built something. So the what they've built is always super curious. And this is, I don't care if it was house homegrown built or agency built. I've seen plenty of things built by agencies as well that are very scary.
Yep.
But I'd love to hear, Danielle, like what are kind of the common use cases that are wrong that you people build so that if they're watching and they're like, well, wait, that's what we use lead scoring for. That's, that it kind of raises the red flag.
Yeah, some warning signs that maybe you need to revisit your lead scoring. One is if you have like a fully loaded score and you don't have some way of separating that out into behavioral and fit at like a bare minimum on a contact level, then that's probably something you should go visit.
Mhm.
If your score is called HubSpot score, it means you haven't done a whole lot of customization, or maybe you set it up a while ago and haven't taken a look at the tool since. Um, there was a new release for the lead scoring app. I think it's still in beta. It is still in beta.
It
That
is, but
happened
it's
like,
public beta, so
yeah,
everybody can get to it.
yeah. So that was released, I think, last summer. And it still has some limitations and some funny things, but generally speaking, it's a significantly improved
Yeah.
experience, excuse me, in building your lead score. And it has some features built into it that you used to have to manually build through workflows and like calculated fields and all those kinds of things, where it like decrements over time for behavioral interactions. Um, and they just this week added negative scoring, which is really exciting because obviously we had that in the old lead scoring app and now we have it in the new one. Um, so yeah, some red flags are if it's just called HubSpot score, you probably haven't done a whole lot of customization. If you have too many things built into a single score, that's one for me. Can you think of any others that you've seen? I'm sure there's a lot.
That one's the number one, right? If you
Yeah,
have both demographic and behavioral scoring properties in one thing, then you're already off on the wrong foot.
right.
So you immediately should pause and like reassess it. I think the other piece for me, more so than how it's built, is how it's used. And so like I see a lot of people use their lead scoring and try to be very strategic with it, not only in terms of prioritizing their prospects and their outbound, but also in terms of how they're actually cycling through their marketing contacts. And so
Mhm.
um, you want to be really careful when you're doing that you're not over limiting yourself, right? There's always going to be scenarios that fall outside of what you've thought to put into your lead scoring. So if somebody, finds these other ways to get into your database, you don't want to accidentally ignore them,
Mhm.
or cause them to not be routed to sales or whatever your procedure is, just because there was a limitation in your own lead scoring. So, highly suggest having duplicate efforts
Mhm.
in how you utilize lead scoring. For instance, if you have inbound forms, right, and all leads that come through those sales forms get routed to sales, keep that process with the lead scoring layered into it
Mhm.
versus saying it's only if somebody comes through this form, or it's only if somebody hits this lead score that they're going to be routed, because just
Mhm.
chances are there's going to be a time you miss something and you're not going to be able to necessarily easily catch it. So I think that how it's being used is really important.
Yeah, and that reminds me, a lot of times I'll see a score like live and die with the marketing team. So like
Mhm.
it gets to MQL, and all anybody cares about is the MQL, and then it doesn't matter anymore. You
Yeah.
can use lead scoring for prioritization, and especially if you're using that for like activity alerts, if you have kind of a threshold for alert, and if the score goes up by a certain amount of points, then alert somebody or like alert an account owner, alert the assigned SDR. There's a lot that you can do with it past that MQL point.
Yes.
And you can even map that to further life cycle stages too. So
Mhm.
you can use it both further up the funnel and further down the funnel. Like I said, it's usually just the MQL cliff that you're kind of running towards. And then everyone sets their, automations based off of that. But if you can move people through those other stages, then you're assigning numerical value to your entire pipeline, which is a bit of a dream scenario, but I don't know if anybody's really at that point. But you can start to see how they move through, and then that gives you a beautiful trail of things to audit when you come back to your lead score to assess its like value and how well it's working.
Yeah, I think that's a great ideal case. I do see people also make the mistake of in their actual numbering, that being determined by maybe one sole person in marketing.
Hmm.
And so a lot of times, just whoever sets up the lead scoring is the person who determines the rubric of what the values are going to be. And when that's the case, you can get some really funky things. Like it's going to have that individual's bias,
Yep.
and that individual's perception of what the goal is of the score at the end result, right? So, I give an example of one that I've seen recently. Was a lead score that was being used predominantly to get people to a sales readiness stage, right? And so everything that was in the lead score were all those last touch big interactions.
Hmm.
Um, and then it also had their demographics in it. But basically, they were really just looking for, like, did the person do one of the really big things? Did they go to our pricing page? Did they look at our quote? Did they, did they do these big things? If so, we want to alert the sales team and we want to start routing these guys. And so that was a great one to be able to highlight for the client and say, hey, there's nothing wrong with what
Right.
exists in here, but it is incomplete because there are so many other actions that people are taking that are meaningful,
Hmm.
that as those accumulate, you wanna know. Like, somebody just lands on my pricing page once is very different from someone who never lands on my pricing page, but they have continued to interact with thought-provoking content that you've produced and are also responding to outbound messages and are the perfect ICP. Like,
Yeah.
I wanna go double down and reach out to them. So that's another thing that I think lead scoring can fix is, like, we can make sure that there's sales and marketing alignment
Yep.
for who sales really should be prioritizing and spending their time talking to. And it's not just from marketing's perspective, it's not just from sales perspective. This is an opportunity to have synergy in really your revenue team and
Yeah.
everyone seeing together, like, what parts of the journey do we care most about putting manual effort behind?
Yeah.
And these are the times that lead scoring can then bring that to the forefront so we can action it.
Yeah, you remind me of a funny anecdote. I was on a call. I truthfully don't remember who I was on the call with, but this happened like last week. And they were like, "Well, what about the events that we spend a lot of money on? We want to score those higher." And I was like, "Not necessarily, maybe, but like, are you taking over as the primary sponsor of a conference? Maybe then you do. But if you just happen to buy a really expensive booth in the back corner, we're not going to score that very high."
Um,
Um, but I think to your point where you want to make sure that everybody's part of that conversation, when you have the data, it gives you something to measure against. So you can go back in and see like what percentage of these, converted once they got past the MQL point, or what percentage of these in this range converted to revenue. And
mhm.
you can actually use those numbers in a calculator to get you to the point where you're proving whether or not your model is right. And you should do the same thing with your deal stages. Are
Right.
your deal stage percentage is actually accurate? Are you closing 10% of the opportunities that you open? Are you closing, 50% of the ones that reach that mid stage? And do the same thing with your pipeline and your lead scoring to really make sure it's accurate and you remove a lot of that bias.
Yeah. One of the things I'm excited about for this week in unpacking lead scoring, because I mean, this is something that at least with my clients, like it's probably 3 solid conversations to get through it. Like, it's one to kinda educate and set the precedent of what we're building and why, and then another one to actually bring the primary stakeholders together and just get something drafted on paper, and then a third to really work through, alignment and, like, getting sign off for everybody to do it. And so this week, I mean, we're kinda gonna go through that process, but in, like, little 15-minute chunks,
Yeah.
and like be talking about auditing what's already there and like how to deep dive if you already have one to know if stuff needs to be changed, how to get stakeholders, on the same page and use this as a positive strategy for
Right.
alignment, not just as a thing that has to get done as a tactic. And I think that's huge power in lead scoring. I always almost always start with lead scoring
Yeah.
working with somebody new because it gives me so much insight into where there's a breakdown in
Yeah.
communication between orgs. So use it for that purpose.
Yeah.
And then like how to also use lead scoring to like help with prioritization and sales enablement, right? To your point, goes beyond marketing.
Mhm.
How can we continue to use this to help with like recycling leads and doing things that need to be done
Mhm.
throughout the life cycle of a contact. And then you mentioned the other day too the types of lead scoring, so like
Mhm.
beyond whether we do it at the
As well.
company level or the contact level, like what is the type of things that we need to measure if we're doing enterprise offerings or if we're doing a product like growth perspective or if
Yeah.
we're doing like a B2C quick, conversion process, like lead scoring has to be personalized to your specific business type. And I think that's going to be a really fun one to unpack too.
Yeah, I know. I get really excited about different types of lead scores. I think one thing to look out as you start to formulate your lead score or come back to it and revisit your lead score is to have that documentation somewhere outside of HubSpot. So it is significantly easier to sort of scroll through and see all of the criteria that goes into your lead score, but it's still easier, more so if you get it into a spreadsheet document.
Yep.
I have one, I have a template that I'm always willing to share, but it breaks down like what are the subcategories within like a behavioral score. So it's like
Yep.
online
Same.
interactions, event. I know we probably built the same like
We probably
spreadsheet
have built something very similar.
independent of each other. But it breaks it down into those subcategories so that you can think through it and have those conversations a little bit more in a more straightforward way and
Yeah.
compare notes with your sales team on like what actually works. And then I also use that as a change log. So what day something was
Mhm.
implemented, because as soon as you hit save, it goes live.
Yeah,
And the
and
new
it
lead
is
scoring app.
retroactive, and I think that's a thing that's
Yeah.
also important, but in a really positive way. Like, I'm very glad
Right.
that it's retroactive because it
Same.
lets it be a live thing. It lets you learn and adapt your lead score. So if you are looking or, you're hearing this and you're going, I I need to revisit it, but that changes all the leads that are in my database, and they're gonna, how am I gonna get those all updated based on what I do figure out is the right
Yeah.
method? Well, that's great. It's gonna automatically change all of their score numbers. So you really only have to focus on getting the lead scoring better and then where things are triggered based off of your lead score, making sure that those are appropriate. But I love that you don't have to go back and try to like manually update
Yeah.
things, for people that already exist because um, that's nearly impossible. So having it be retroactive makes it much more forgiving to like learn along the way. Or if you think of like a specific behavior that you didn't used to be able to measure and now
Mhm.
you can,
Mhm.
like it's great. You just add it in there and it'll retroactively like add that for people. And
But
I think that's great.
but it does send it through and you can accidentally
Yes.
MQL 35,000 people. Ask me
Do
how I
not
know.
accidentally MQL 35,000 people. That is a great call out. I think we should talk about that a little bit more like tomorrow when we are going through auditing your lead score.
Yeah.
And we can add kind of how to avoid huge issues of mass
Yes.
MQLing.
There's a lot
Um,
of learning there.
there so
A lot of
much
lived experience.
actual life experience. Yes.
Alrighty. So I think that's a good stopping point, and we look forward to seeing everyone back tomorrow for a discussion on auditing your lead score and how to get started.
Perfect. All right. Bye.
Bye.
All
End
right. I
screen
gotta jump and run
recording.
to a doctor's appointment. So I will see you tomorrow.